What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be doing a flamethrower. Now when I was online looking around trying to figure out what exactly I wanted to make for this week's model, I came across a really amazing piece of art by Nikolay Myhalenko. Now I'm probably saying that completely wrong, but really great artist that did an amazing piece for Metro Exodus. Not exactly sure what game, but it looked really cool and I thought it'd be fun to recreate. I've never created a flamethrower before, so I decided why not? Let's just go with this. Now this week's model was a little more difficult than usual. For some reason my brain just didn't want to work. I just had the hardest time making decisions and choosing what colors to use and what shapes to put where, especially because I didn't have the whole reference and I couldn't see in all the little nooks and crannies of the models, so I had to just create some stuff along the way. I guess you could say I had a little bit of artist block or something along those lines, but either way we got through it and I was pretty happy with how the results turned out. So without me dragging this on anymore, let's just dive into it. Alright, so let's start blocking everything out. Now I'm going to start off with the barrel and then I can move my way on to all the other smaller objects in the scene. Now I am going off of this guy's artwork, but I don't necessarily know how all these components are attaching together, especially in these smaller areas, so it's going to be a little bit of experimenting and playing around with shapes until I just find something that looks good to me and that I'm happy with. So let's start blocking things out and then we can start moving on to the others. Alright, so the barrel's looking good. Now we can move on to that large metal piece, basically that sits in the middle that holds everything together. So let's create another cube and we can start blocking out this shape. Now just to make my life a little bit easier, I'm just going to focus on one side of the shape and then we can just cut it in half and mirror it over to create the other side. so that's good enough for now. I don't want to refine it too much because I know I'm going to be adding other objects in and things will change. So let's jump on to that gas tank that sits on the top and start blocking that out. Alright, so the shapes are coming together. Now I'm just going to keep blocking things out and keep adding different shapes to the scene. So I'm going to let the next little bit play out as I'm just blocking things out, and we can start refining them in a little bit. So let's go ahead and start doing that. Alright, so the shapes are slowly coming together. Now we're just going to add a few hoses and different wires and stuff to this model. So I'm going to do that with the Sweet Mesh using the EP Curve tool. And once I draw in all those points, I can go edit those vertices just to get that shape of that line of that wire that I had in mind. So let's go ahead and start blocking that out. Alright, so before changing this EP Curve tool to a Sweet Mesh, I'm just going to start adding in a few other objects in the scene before doing that. I just don't want to finalize this chord. I know things are going to change, especially this week's model, because I just have no idea the direction it's going and my brain's not working as well as it should be. So I'm just going to take my time, add a few other objects, and I can come back to finalize this chord afterwards. So let's go ahead and start blocking a few other things out. Now throughout this whole model, you're going to see me constantly just resizing things and changing shapes, and that's just because I didn't know proportionally how I wanted everything to look. I did have that reference that I was going off of, but I still just didn't exactly know how I wanted things to look, and I didn't know how a lot of these components fit together, so it was just constantly experimenting and reshaping and just changing things. So I'm trying to keep it as blocked out and low poly as possible without obviously keeping it too low poly, because I want to start refining the shapes slowly as I go, but I don't want to finalize everything. I want to keep it in a state that I can easily come back to and make adjustments. So I'm not going to delete history on anything, so I can go back and change the bevels and edit all the settings that I have done to each shape. So let's just continue on and keep blocking things out. Alright, so the shape is looking a little bit better. Now let's move on to start blocking out those handles. And to make my life a little bit easier, I'm just going to reuse that same curve that we created earlier. I'm just going to duplicate it over and just change those vertices to line up with this shape that I just created. One thing I wanted to mention with all these little bevels that I'm doing, I normally will go clean them up in the UVing process so I can attach all of those edges to make them flow nice. Now the only reason why I'm not doing it now is so I can retain that history and the information, so I can go back and edit those bevels depending on if I want them to change. As I'm slowly putting these pieces together, I know there's going to be a few bevels that I'll want to change, just to increase the bevel or decrease them depending on how it's looking. So I find I can work a little bit more freely using this kind of workflow, just adding those bevels, not really worrying too much about topology and how clean things look, so I can always come back when it's all finalized and clean them up. Alright, so things are slowly coming together. Now let's quickly jump back to those curves that we created earlier. We can turn those into sweep meshes. Alright, so let's just continue on and add a few more objects. we have most of the objects in the scene. Now I'm just going to jump back to these shapes so we can start refining a few things. Now, just like we did earlier, copying over that EP curve tool, I'm going to do the exact same thing so I can start blocking out my other wires and cords. Alright, so now that we have most of the shapes in the scene, I'm going to start refining things and changing the shape and the sizes. It's going to be a lot easier now that I see how everything's lined up together. I can start just messing around with the shapes to make them work a little bit better, in my opinion. So let's start refining a few things and cleaning everything up. Alright, so I thought it'd be a good idea and make it a little bit more realistic if I attach these two cylinders together. So all I'm going to do is duplicate the top one to make two of them, and I can just boolean out a hole directly where that cylinder is sitting. And then afterwards I can take those two edges and just bridge them together. All I have to do is make sure that the points on the end of the cylinder match the exact same amount of points that are in my boolean. That way the bridge will work and all the vertices can connect to each other. So let's go ahead and create this boolean and we can attach these two cylinders. Alright, so next up is just wrapping up the remaining wires and little cords, and once those are finished we can start refining the other shapes we already have done, start beveling out some edges just to create some more higher poly models. So let's go ahead and wrap up these wires and then we can start refining the model. for this dial, what I'm going to do is select all the faces on the inside and extract them just so I can separate them from the mesh. And that way it'll just be easier for me to scale it and size it on my UV map so I can make sure I can get some nice resolution on that graphic that I'm going to get off of Google later on in Substance Painter. And then all I have to do is just duplicate that exact same face that I extracted, and I can slide it forward, and we're going to assign a glass material to that face later on in Substance as well. Now I do really quickly model a tiny needle for the inside of this gauge, but I do however remove it later on since the graphic and the image that I have has a dial already in place, and I didn't want the two dials or the two little sticks to be overlapping, so I do remove this later on in the model. Alright, so the modeling is almost done. I just want to start adding a few extra shapes in the middle just to make it a little bit more complicated and fill in some of those empty areas. Now, on my reference photos that I am following along, I don't know how these inside components work. The image is very dark, so I can't really see the tiny components, so I'm just going to start throwing in some random shapes and just extruding some edges and just having fun with a few different styles and shapes until I find something that I'm happy with. I'm not going to be too stuck on this certain idea that's in my reference. I'm just going to try to work a little freely and just start populating the inside of this model. So let's go ahead and start doing that. Now I just want to really quickly mention, as you can see, these vertices are quite messed up, and this is definitely an area that I would clean up in my UVing process, so I'm not going to do it right now, just because I want to keep my history on this bevel so I can change it depending on how I want it to look when it's in its final stages. So I'm just going to leave it as is. I just want to move some of these vertices off the edge so they're not floating into space, but I will come back to these and clean it up later. Alright, so basically all of the modeling is done. For the rest of the modeling video, I'm just going to let it play out, as all I'm doing is just copying over screws and placing them in various places, as well as beveling some of the edges and just changing the positions of some of these shapes. So let's go ahead and keep refining this model until I'm happy with it, and then we can wrap it up and start texturing. Alright, so the modeling is all wrapped up. Now I'm just going to really quickly show you exactly how I did those UVs, and then we'll jump into texturing. So here's the model in its finished form. I was pretty happy with it, could have done better, but you know, it was a rough week. So I split this up into two different textures. The first one being all the main components like the gas tank and the barrel, and then the second one being all the little components like all the inside stuff. I decided to break it up into two since there's so many little components, and yeah, that's just how I decided to go about it. I'm going to quickly show you in the checkered form how everything looks. Now I probably could have just broken this down into one, but I wanted to try to get a little bit more resolution out of the textures, so that's the reason why I broke it up into two. Alright, so now let's jump into Substance Painter so we can start texturing. So now in Substance Painter, I can go ahead and load in my FBX from Maya. And once that model is loaded into Substance, I take a quick look at it to make sure that no objects are missing and the UV maps are looking good, there's no overlapping UVs. Now I didn't look hard enough because there is a little object that was missing that I catch later on, so definitely take a quick look to make sure everything's there. Now once that looks good, I can go over to my texture set settings, scroll down to bake mesh maps. I can go choose my output size, I chose 4K, and then make sure to check on that little box to use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. And then you're ready to texture. Alright, so we're going to start off with texture 1, which is the main metal pieces of this whole flamethrower, and I'm just going to start off using some of the built-in smart materials that come with Substance Painter. So I'm just going to select some random different metals and apply them to these meshes to see what looks best, and then I can further adjust these textures and settings depending on however I want it to look. So all I'm doing here is setting it to a black mask and then assigning it to the various meshes in my scene. And then once those are all applied, I can go start tweaking some of those settings. Now all I'm doing here is just making sure I have different variations of metals to these different components. I don't want it all looking the same. I want different pieces looking like they have different wear and tear on them, or look like some are a little more grungy and beat up than others. So let's go ahead and start adding a few little details. So how I'm going to do that is by adding a fill layer, and I'm just going to go over to my mask tab and drag on whatever mask I would like to put on top of that fill layer. So depending on whatever color I set that fill layer to, that grunge effect or whatever that masking effect is going to show on top of that texture. So let's go add a little bit of wear on top of these metals to make them look a little bit more worn out. Now I just thought I would give a little bit of a warning. I was extra lazy in this week's model and I didn't name any of my layers. So if you're going to take anything away from this video, it would be name all of your layers and all of your different materials. It just makes going back and adjusting these so much easier. Because I don't do that, I have to go through and turn on and off each material to see what's applied to each object. And it just makes the process a lot longer when it really doesn't have to be. So that's just one area that I wish I did differently. Don't make the same mistakes that I do. Now I'm not going to be too stuck on a certain idea or look and try to get it perfectly dialed in off the start. I'm just going to move on and try to fill in all of these plain white meshes that I have in my scene, and then I can always move back and start refining the other ones that I have already applied to the other meshes. So I'm just going to keep repeating this process by adding various smart materials and then adding different fill layers with different masks to add different grunge effects on top of them. So let's go ahead and start filling out these empty meshes with some textures. Now next up was doing that gauge glass texture, and there's a few small things we have to do to actually make that see-through material work properly. So I'm just going to go over to my Smart Materials tab and grab this glass visor material. I'm just going to open up that folder, hide the dirt, and then go to my top right corner to my shader settings, and I have to switch that shader to alpha blending. So what that's going to do is allow me to add an opacity channel to my texture so I can make it transparent. So if I go over to my texture set settings, scroll down to that little plus icon, I can go choose opacity. So now if I go back to my material I applied, you will see that now you can see through it, and that's just because we added that opacity channel to the texture. So now I'm just going to go over, like we did before, add a fill layer, and I can go choose a different mask to add a little bit of grunge on top of that glass. That way it doesn't look as clear and it looks a little bit more worn out. Now for the gauge image itself, I just hopped on Google Images and just Googled in PSI. I'm pretty sure these use PSI, but I could be wrong. So maybe this gauge is completely incorrect. So sorry for that if it is, but I found an image of a gauge on Google and I thought it'd be fitting. So I just saved that as a JPEG. I could drag that directly into my scene, set that to my current session and as a texture, and I can just go directly paste that image right onto that plane. Alright, so the gauge is looking good. Now I'm just going to jump onto all the other meshes I have in my scene and apply some materials to them. Now keep in mind, I was very indecisive throughout this whole texturing process. I really didn't know exactly what colors I wanted to go with, and everything was just looking wrong. It was just one of those weeks where nothing was flowing good, so it was really difficult. So I'm not going to be too stuck on getting the materials right off the bat. I'm just going to come back and adjust them as I go along through the texturing process. So let's go ahead and start applying some more materials to these meshes. Alright, so for this handle, I tried experimenting with a few small things. I wanted to get a cool little bump effect that was through that leather material, so I just started experimenting a little bit, but I ended up removing all of this and just throwing on a plain leather simple material at the end. I just didn't like the direction this went, so like I said, it was a tough week and my brain just didn't want to work properly, so I'm just going to go ahead and start experimenting with a few things, but like I said, I end up just removing this and going with just a simple leather material on the grips. So I didn't like exactly how this barrel was looking. I didn't like that metal material on it. It was looking too consistent with the other metals, so I tried experimenting with another iron forged material, another smart material in Substance Painter, and I think it looked much better. It looked a little bit more worn out and a little dirtier in certain areas, so I decided to go with this one and just refined a few of those settings. So I'm just going to let the next little bit of the video play out, as all I'm doing is the exact same process, applying different smart materials to these meshes, then adding different masking effects over top of that to make them a little bit more worn out. So let's go ahead and start applying different materials to these meshes. Alright, so the materials are looking a little bit better. Now I just want to add a little bit of detail into these materials. I want to add a little bit of some welding marks around some of these objects. So there's a few ways I'm going to do this. I'm just going to jump on Substance Source website. They have this really cool material. It's like a bright pink blue material that you usually get from welding. And I just downloaded that, and I'm just going to drag it right into my project, set that as a base material, and then assign it to my current session. So before I start applying that base color to my material, I just need to add some bump effect where that welding mark will be. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and add a fill layer that's in the folder of that material that's applied to the object. I'm going to click off the color channel since I don't need that, and I'm going to click on the height channel since we need some bump into that material. Then I'm just going to search up the welding brush, which comes with Substance Painter, and then I can double click that and then start painting on some welding marks. Now depending on how high we set that height slider, it's depending on how much bump is going to show in the material, but I'm just going to go ahead and start just pasting on some welding marks around the shape. Alright, now once I'm happy with that, I just want to continue doing those welding marks on the object above it. Now, how I set these UVs up, that little box is sitting on the other texture maps, so all I'm going to do is just copy the same welding marks over to my other texture, go find the material that's applied to that shape, and I can open up that folder and paste that material directly into it and continue doing that same welding that we did previously to this other shape. Now lucky for me, because our model is looking pretty beaten up, I don't need to worry about having perfect welding marks. It actually benefits me, I think, if it looks a little bit messy. So I'm not going to worry about doing it perfectly. I just want it to look a little bit bumpy, like there's some sort of welding that's attached to that shape. So once I'm happy with the welding marks, we can go find that material that I found on the Substance Source website, and I can start painting on that pink purple material directly over top of the welds. Now what I want to do is just go a little excessive off the start, and I can always erase it or turn up my opacity on that material and make it blend in a little bit better. So let's start applying that material to my welding. Alright, so the welding's looking good, and I honestly could have just left it as is, but in my reference photo they were having a little bit of blue and pink color that was going up the shape a little bit. I guess from the welding marks, that pink sort of blue material sort of gradually works its way up, just very subtly. So what we're going to do is just choose one of these plastic materials. I can go in and change the color of that afterwards and start basically just coloring on that material directly above the welding, and then I can start blending that color in to fit with the object. So this is definitely one of those things, the longer you spend on it, the better it's going to look. So I don't want to spend too long. Let's just start blending in these colors a little bit more so it fits a little bit better with the object. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to come back and refine it a little bit more, but let's just go do the exact same process on other parts of my model. Alright, so the weldings are looking better. It just needs a little bit of some brown texture in there. Basically from the flame from burning and melting that metal and welding them together, there's going to be a little bit of some brown, burnt sort of color that's in the material. So we're just going to do the exact same process we just did, create a new layer and just change that color to a little beige brown color, and then start coloring on that material right around those welding marks. Alright, we're going to do the exact same process to the front of the barrel. And I'm just going to exaggerate the colors just a tiny bit just to make sure that they pop out in the render. Alright, so the weldings are looking good. Now let's just go refine a few of the materials I already have applied to the objects. so now quickly jumping into the renderer, I'm going to remove that background just so I have a solid color, and I can start just changing these environment lighting maps just so I can have a closer look at these materials, and then we can jump back in to make some further adjustments. One of the things that stood out to me right away were these small little red and blue wires. They were just looking very clean, like they were brand new wires that were installed on this flamethrower, so I'm just going to add a little bit of grunge and dirt effect to go over top of them. Alright, so now quickly jumping back into the renderer once again, I can just mess around with this lighting just to find a lighting source that matches the object. Now while I was looking around, I honestly thought I was all finished until I spun the model around and I noticed that I was missing an object. Now when I bring my models into Substance Painter, I always say I take a quick look at the model to make sure everything's there, and I just honestly didn't take a close enough look because there was an object, that little handle that we made, that I just for some reason wasn't exported, and I'm not sure exactly what happened, but we're just going to quickly jump back into Maya so I can bring that model back in, so I can re-export it properly, so I can apply some quick materials just to fill in those last remaining objects, and then we can quickly wrap up the model. I also really quickly want to show you those handles I was talking about. So I ended up removing those and just going with a simple leather look. I had these dark brown ones and these lighter ones I was comparing, and I really was torn between the two. I like the lighter ones honestly a little bit better, but they were looking a little bit too clean compared to the other objects in the model. So I ended up just going with this darker brown leather material that comes preset with Substance Painter. And I just thought it fit a little bit better. I didn't like that bump effect we had earlier, so that's just one little final adjustment I made before doing these final renders. But that's basically everything. That is the whole texturing and modeling process that I did to create this flamethrower. Thanks so much for tuning into this week's video. It was definitely a difficult one for me. I had a little bit of artist's block, or my brain just didn't want to work this week. And it happens, you just have to fight your way through it, and that's exactly what we did. So thanks so much for tuning into this week's video. If you liked it, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. Also, if you want to support the channel even further, as well as get access to additional content, check out my Patreon page, which I will link in the description below. Alright, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.